I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled my John Deere 7230R combine harvester into the driveway of my new house in Meadowbrook Estates, just outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The machine was massive, painted in that iconic green and yellow, with its header folded up for transport. I had just purchased the property 3 months ago, a modest 2-story colonial on the edge of this planned community, specifically because it bordered my family's farmland. My name is Henry Xander, and I'm a third-generation farmer who recently inherited 200 acres from my grandfather. The house was perfect because I could live in relative comfort while still being close enough to manage the farm operation efficiently. The harvester had been acting up all week during the late corn harvest, and my regular mechanic shop was backed up for 2 weeks. My cousin Marcus, who worked as a diesel mechanic in town, had agreed to come by my place on Saturday morning to take a look at the hydraulic system that controlled the header. It made perfect sense to park it in my driveway Friday evening rather than haul it all the way back to the equipment barn on the far side of the property, only to bring it back the next day. The driveway was plenty wide, and I made sure the harvester was positioned so it did not block the sidewalk or street. I had checked the local ordinances before moving in, and I knew that farm equipment was explicitly allowed under Iowa state law, given the agricultural nature of the region. I had just finished securing the harvester and was heading inside when I noticed a woman marching across her lawn toward me. She was maybe 55, with a short blonde bob that looked like it had been shellacked into place, wearing a purple velour tracksuit despite the chilly November evening. Her face was already red with anger before she even reached my property line. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I turned to face her, wiping my hands on my work jeans. "Just parking my equipment. I have some maintenance work scheduled for tomorrow morning." "That is absolutely unacceptable," she declared, stopping at the edge of my driveway with her hands on her hips. "I'm Carol Jennings, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and we have very strict rules about what can be parked in residential driveways. That monstrosity is completely inappropriate for this neighborhood." I felt my jaw tighten, but kept my voice level. "It's farm equipment, and this house borders agricultural land. I'm exempt under Iowa farm vehicle laws." Carol's eyes narrowed. "I don't care what you think you're exempt from. Our HOA covenants clearly state that only passenger vehicles and standard pickup trucks are allowed in driveways. Everything else must be kept in garages or behind privacy fences. That thing is an eyesore and it needs to be moved immediately." With all due respect, Mrs. Jennings, state law supersedes HOA regulations when it comes to agricultural equipment. I've done my research. She pulled out her phone and started tapping at the screen with one manicured fingernail. "We'll see about that. If you don't move it by morning, I'll be taking action." "I'm not moving it," I said firmly. "My mechanic is coming at 8 tomorrow morning and it stays right where it is." Carol's face went even redder. "Fine. Don't say I didn't warn you." She spun on her heel and stalked back to her house, which was directly across the street from mine. I watched her go, feeling a knot of tension forming in my stomach. I had heard horror stories about HOAs, but I had not expected to run into trouble this quickly. Inside, I made myself dinner and tried to put the encounter out of my mind. The harvester was legal. I had checked Iowa Code Chapter 321.1, which defined farm tractors and specifically exempted them from many standard vehicle regulations. I had also looked into the case law, including several instances where courts had ruled that HOA restrictions could not supersede state agricultural laws. I was in the right, and I knew it. The next morning, I woke up at 6:30 to the sound of someone pounding on my front door. I pulled on a sweatshirt and headed downstairs, wondering if Marcus had arrived early. Instead, I opened the door to find two Cedar Rapids police officers standing on my porch. Behind them, parked at the curb, was a patrol car with its lights off. Carol Jennings stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, wearing another tracksuit, this one in hot pink. "Henry Xander?" the first officer asked. He was young, maybe 25, with a nameplate that read Officer Rodriguez. "That's me. What's this about?" "We received a complaint about an illegally parked vehicle blocking the neighborhood." He glanced back at the harvester, which was impossible to miss. "I'm assuming that's what we're here about." "It's not illegally parked," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. "It's farm equipment and I'm exempt under state law." The second officer, older and heavier with Officer Patterson on his nameplate, stepped forward. "Sir, that's a pretty big piece of machinery. Is there a reason it can't be kept somewhere else?" "I'm having it serviced this morning. My mechanic is coming at 8. It would be a waste of time and fuel to move it to my equipment barn and then bring it back." Carol called out from the sidewalk. "It's been there since yesterday evening. It's a violation of our community standards, and I want it removed now." Officer Rodriguez looked between us, clearly not thrilled to be in the middle of a neighborhood dispute. "Do you have any documentation about this exemption you mentioned?" "I do." "Give me a minute." I went back inside and grabbed my folder of property documents, including printouts of the relevant Iowa Code sections I had researched. I brought them back to the door and handed them to Rodriguez. He scanned through them, his partner reading over his shoulder. After a moment, Patterson nodded. "He's right. Farm equipment is exempt. As long as it's not blocking the public right-of-way, there's no violation here." Carol's voice went up an octave. "That can't be right. Our HOA has rules." "Madam," Patterson said, turning to face her, "HOA rules can't override state law. If this gentleman owns farmland and this is legitimate agricultural equipment, he's within his rights to park it on his own property." "This is ridiculous," Carol sputtered. "This is a residential community, not a barnyard." Rodriguez handed my documents back to me. "You're all set, Mr. Xander. Sorry for the inconvenience." He lowered his voice slightly. "You might want to document this interaction just in case there are more complaints." "I will." "Thank you, officers." They headed back to their patrol car, stopping briefly to say something to Carol that I could not hear. She responded with an animated gesture toward my house, but the officers just shook their heads and got into their vehicle. After they drove away, Carol stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, glaring at me and the harvester. Then she pulled out her phone and started typing furiously. I closed the door and took a deep breath. This was not how I wanted to start my Saturday morning. But at least the police had confirmed what I already knew. I was in the right. Marcus arrived right at 8, driving his diesel pickup with a toolbox in the bed. He was a big guy, 6'4" and built like a linebacker, with a perpetual grin that made it hard to take anything too seriously. He climbed out of the truck and let out a low whistle when he saw the harvester. "Man, you really did park this beast right in your driveway. That took some guts in a place like this." "Didn't think it would be a problem," I said, walking out to meet him. "But the HOA president already called the cops on me this morning." "Seriously?" Marcus laughed. "What did they say?" "That I'm legal and she needs to back off. But something tells me this isn't over." "HOA people are the worst," Marcus said, shaking his head. "My buddy Steve got fined $300 because his mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Can you believe that?" We spent the next 2 hours working on the hydraulic system. The problem turned out to be a faulty valve that was causing pressure issues. Marcus had a replacement in his truck, and we got it swapped out without too much trouble. By 10:30, we were test running the header movement and everything was functioning smoothly. "That should do it," Marcus said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You're good to go. I owe you big time. Let me buy you lunch. Deal." As Marcus was packing up his tools, a silver Lexus pulled up in front of my house. Carol got out, followed by two other people. A thin man in his 60s wearing khakis and a polo shirt, and a woman in her 40s with severely pulled back dark hair and a business suit despite it being Saturday morning. "Oh boy," Marcus muttered. "Here comes the welcoming committee." The three of them approached us in a formation that would have been comical if it was not so clearly aggressive. Carol led the way, with the other two flanking her like bodyguards. "Mr. Xander," Carol announced, "this is Donald Peterson, our HOA vice president, and Linda Marshall, our association attorney." The woman in the suit stepped forward, holding a leather portfolio. "Mr. Xander, I'm here to formally notify you that you are in violation of Meadowbrook Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions, specifically Section 7, Paragraph 3, which prohibits the parking of commercial vehicles, farm equipment, and oversized machinery in any location visible from the street." I crossed my arms. "And I'm here to remind you that Iowa state law explicitly exempts farm vehicles from local restrictions, including HOA covenants. The police were already here this morning and confirmed that I'm in compliance with the law." Linda's expression did not change. "The police don't interpret civil contracts, Mr. Xander. Our covenants are legally binding agreements that you entered into when you purchased your property. You signed these documents at closing." "I did," I acknowledged. "And I also reviewed them with my real estate attorney, who confirmed that any clauses that conflict with state agricultural exemptions are unenforceable." "That's your interpretation," Linda said coolly. "Ours differs. If you don't remove the equipment by 5 p.m. today, we will begin assessing fines of $100 per day until you come into compliance." Marcus stepped up beside me. "You're really going to fine him for fixing his work equipment on his own property?" "This isn't your concern," Carol snapped. "Actually, it kind of is," Marcus said. "I'm the one who did the repair work, and I'm a witness to the fact that this harvester is legitimate farm equipment used in active agricultural operations. That makes it exempt under Iowa Code 321. Donald, the vice president, spoke up for the first time. His voice was reedy and nervous. "Perhaps we could reach a compromise. Mr. Xander could agree to keep the equipment out of sight except when absolutely necessary for immediate repairs." "No compromise," Carol said firmly. "Rules are rules." "Then I guess we'll see each other in court," I said. "Because I'm not paying any fines, and I'm not changing how I manage my farm equipment based on an unenforceable HOA rule." Linda pulled a document from her portfolio and held it out to me. "This is formal notice of the violation and the fine structure. You have 15 days to respond or request a hearing before the HOA board. After that, if you remain in violation, we can place a lien on your property." I took the document, glanced at it, and tucked it under my arm. "I'll have my attorney respond. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get my equipment back to the barn." "See," Carol said triumphantly. "He's moving it." "Because the repair work is done," I said slowly, as if explaining to a child. "Not because of your threats. I'll be parking it here again whenever I need to do maintenance, and there's not a thing you can do about it." Carol's face went purple. "We'll see about that." The three of them retreated to the Lexus, with Carol and Linda having what looked like an intense conversation while Donald just stood there looking uncomfortable. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder. "Man, you really know how to make friends." "Not my fault they're unreasonable," I said. "Come on, let's get some food. I need a beer after this morning." I climbed into the harvester and fired it up, the diesel engine rumbling to life. The hydraulics worked perfectly now, and I was able to get the machine moved off my property and down the farm access road to the equipment barn without any issues. Marcus followed in his truck, and we met up at a local sports bar called the Rusty Bucket about 20 minutes later. Over burgers and beer, Marcus asked the obvious question. "So what are you actually going to do about the HOA?" "Fight it," I said. "I'm not letting them bully me into giving up my rights. My grandfather worked that land for 50 years. I'm not going to dishonor his memory by letting some suburban dictator tell me I can't park my own equipment on my own property." "I get that, man, but legal fights are expensive." "I know, but I've got a good lawyer and I'm confident we'll win. The law is pretty clear on this." What I did not mention to Marcus was that I was genuinely worried about the financial aspect. The farm was profitable, but not hugely so. Corn prices had been down the last 2 years, and I was still paying off some of the equipment loans my grandfather had taken out before he passed. A prolonged legal battle with the HOA could eat into my operating budget in a way that would be really painful. But I also knew that if I backed down now, Carol and her cronies would walk all over me for as long as I lived in Meadowbrook Estates. Better to establish boundaries now than to fight constant battles later. The following week was relatively quiet. I moved the harvester back and forth a couple of times for legitimate work reasons, and each time Carol came out to take pictures and presumably document my violations. I ignored her. On Thursday, I received a certified letter from the HOA containing a formal notice that I had been fined $100 for the Saturday violation and would continue to be fined for any future violations. I forwarded the letter to my attorney, Janet Holloway, who had handled my grandfather's estate and my property purchase. Janet called me the next day. "Henry, I've reviewed the HOA documents and their claim. You're absolutely right that you're exempt under state law, but we need to be strategic about how we handle this." "What do you mean?" "HOAs have a lot of power when it comes to liens and collection actions. Even if we ultimately win, they can make your life difficult in the meantime. I'd recommend we request a formal hearing before the HOA board and put our argument on the record. If they still want to pursue fines after that, we can take it to court with a clear record of our position." "How much is this going to cost me?" "For the hearing prep and attendance, probably around $1,500. If it goes to court, we're looking at $5,000 to $10,000, depending on how long it drags out." I rubbed my forehead. That was money I really did not want to spend. "Okay. Let's do the hearing and see if we can resolve this without court. I'll file the request today. They have to schedule it within 30 days. The hearing was set for a Tuesday evening 3 weeks later, held in the community center building at the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates. I arrived with Janet at 6:45 for the 7 o'clock meeting. The community center was a bland, beige building with a meeting room that could hold maybe 50 people. When we walked in, I was surprised to see that the room was nearly full. Carol sat at a table at the front with Donald, Linda the attorney, and 2 other board members I had not met before. Residents filled most of the chairs, and I recognized several of my neighbors. Some gave me friendly nods. Others looked away or whispered to their companions. Janet and I took seats in the front row. At exactly 7, Carol banged a gavel on the table like she was presiding over the Supreme Court. "This meeting of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association Board is now called to order. We have one item on tonight's agenda, which is a hearing regarding violations by resident Henry Xander of Section 7, Paragraph 3 of our community covenants. Mr. Xander has requested this hearing to contest the fines assessed against him. Mr. Xander, you have 15 minutes to present your case." Janet stood up. "Madam President, I'm Janet Holloway, Mr. Xander's attorney. With your permission, I'll be presenting our position." Carol looked annoyed but nodded. "Proceed." Janet walked to the front of the room, opened her briefcase, and pulled out several documents. "Thank you. I've prepared copies of our key documents for the board." She handed a stack to Carol, who distributed them to the other board members with obvious reluctance. "The issue here is straightforward," Janet began. "Mr. Xander owns and operates a 200-acre farm that borders this community. He purchased his home specifically because of its proximity to his agricultural operation. On several occasions, he has parked farm equipment in his driveway for legitimate maintenance and repair purposes. The HOA has claimed this violates community covenants and has assessed fines. However, Iowa state law explicitly exempts farm vehicles from local parking restrictions." She walked the board through the relevant statutes, citing Iowa Code 321.1, and several court cases where similar HOA restrictions had been struck down. She also presented documentation of my farm operation, including my agricultural exemption certificate, property tax records showing the land's agricultural classification, and even photos of the corn and soybean crops. "The law is clear," Janet concluded. "While HOA covenants are generally enforceable, they cannot override state statutes, particularly those related to agricultural operations. Mr. Xander is not parking this equipment for aesthetic or recreational purposes. He's using his property in conjunction with his legitimate farming business, which is explicitly protected under Iowa law. We respectfully request that the board rescind all fines and confirm that Mr. Xander is exempt from Section 7, Paragraph 3 for farm vehicle parking." Carol immediately jumped in. "Thank you, Miss Holloway. Now I'd like Linda Marshall, our HOA attorney, to respond." Linda stood up, looking as crisp and professional as she had at my house. "The board's position is that Mr. Xander's interpretation of the law is overly broad. While farm vehicles may be exempt from certain traffic regulations, that doesn't mean they are exempt from private contractual agreements. When Mr. Xander purchased his home, he voluntarily agreed to abide by our covenants. Those covenants exist to protect property values and maintain the character of our community. Allowing large commercial farm equipment to be parked in residential driveways would set a precedent that could lead to all sorts of inappropriate uses. What's next? Livestock in backyards. Grain silos in front yards." Several residents in the audience murmured in agreement. Linda continued, sensing she had support. "Furthermore, Mr. Xander has not demonstrated that parking in his driveway is necessary. He has acknowledged that he owns an equipment barn on his farmland. The fact that it might be more convenient for him to park at his house doesn't override the legitimate interests of his neighbors in maintaining community standards." Janet stood up again. "May I respond?" Carol nodded, though she looked like she had just bitten into a lemon. "The slippery slope argument is a classic logical fallacy," Janet said. "We're not talking about livestock or grain silos. We're talking about occasional parking of farm equipment for maintenance purposes. As for necessity, Iowa courts have consistently held that farmers have the right to make reasonable operational decisions about their equipment. Mr. Xander doesn't need to prove that parking at his house is absolutely necessary, only that it's reasonable in the context of his farming operation. Which it clearly is." The next 20 minutes devolved into a back and forth between the two attorneys, with Carol interjecting frequently to make snide comments about people who think rules don't apply to them. The other board members said very little, though Donald looked increasingly uncomfortable as the meeting went on. Finally, Carol called for a vote. All in favor of upholding the fines against Mr. Xander. Carol, Linda, and one of the other board members raised their hands. Opposed. Donald and the fifth board member, a quiet woman named Susan, raised their hands. The motion passes 3-2, Carol announced with obvious satisfaction. The fines stand, and Mr. Xander will be charged $100 per day for any future violations. This meeting is adjourned. Janet and I stood up as the room erupted in conversation. Several neighbors approached me as we headed for the door. A man named Tom, who lived 3 houses down, shook my hand. "That was garbage, Henry. You should take them to court." "Probably will," I said. Another neighbor, an older woman named Patricia, patted my arm. "Don't let Carol bully you. She did the same thing to the Hendersons when they wanted to put up a basketball hoop. Some of us are getting really tired of her act." We made our way outside, where Janet turned to me with a grim expression. "I'm sorry, Henry. I really thought we had a chance of convincing them." "Carol was never going to back down," I said. "She made that clear from day one. So what's our next step?" "We file a lawsuit in district court seeking a declaratory judgment that the HOA covenant is unenforceable as applied to your farm vehicles. We'll also ask for an injunction preventing them from collecting the fines or placing a lien on your property while the case is pending." And timeline. Could be anywhere from 6 months to a year, depending on the court's schedule and whether they try to drag it out. I sighed. "Okay, let's do it. I'm not backing down." Janet filed the lawsuit the following week. I continued to park my equipment at my house when I needed to, and Carol continued to document it and send me violation notices. By the end of November, the HOA claimed I owed them nearly $2,000 in fines. Then things took a weird turn. In early December, I came home from a long day of winter field work to find a bright orange sticker plastered on my front door. It was from the Cedar Rapids Code Enforcement Office, claiming that I had received a complaint about unauthorized agricultural activities in a residential zone, and that an inspector would be conducting a site visit within 5 business days. I called Janet immediately. "Did you see this coming?" "No, but I'm not surprised. The HOA must have filed a complaint with the city. They're trying to use code enforcement as a backdoor way to pressure you." "Can they do that?" "They can file a complaint about anything. Whether the city will actually take action is another question. Your property is zoned residential, but the farmland borders it, and you're not conducting any agricultural activities on the residential lot itself, right?" "Right. I'm just parking equipment temporarily." "Then you should be fine, but let me make some calls and see what I can find out." The inspector showed up 3 days later, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Gary who seemed annoyed at having to be there. He walked around my property, took some photos, asked me a few questions about what I was using the house for, and left. 2 weeks later, I received a letter stating that no violations had been found and the complaint was closed. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. In mid-December, I woke up one morning to find that someone had spray-painted "farm trash" across my garage door in bright red letters. I stood in my driveway in my pajamas and winter coat, staring at the graffiti in disbelief. I called the police, and Officer Rodriguez showed up to take a report. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked, photographing the damage. "I've been in a dispute with the HOA president," I said, "but I can't prove she was involved." "Carol Jennings. You know her," Rodriguez gave me a wry smile. "We've responded to a lot of calls from Meadowbrook Estates." "Mrs. Jennings is persistent. That's one word for it. I'll file the report. If you have any security cameras, footage would be helpful." I did not have cameras, but after Rodriguez left, I immediately went online and ordered a comprehensive system. If this was going to escalate, I wanted documentation. The cameras arrived 2 days later, and I spent a Saturday installing them. I put one covering the driveway, one on the front door, one on the back door, and one overlooking my side yard that faced Carol's house. The system saved everything to the cloud, so even if someone vandalized the cameras themselves, I would have the footage. It turned out to be a smart move. On Christmas Eve, I was inside making dinner when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the front camera. I pulled up the app and saw Carol walking up my driveway with a manila envelope in her hand. I watched as she wedged it into my door frame and then stood there for a moment, looking directly at the camera. She had to know it was there. Then she walked away. I opened the door and grabbed the envelope. Inside was another violation notice, this one claiming I owed $3,500 in accumulated fines, plus a $500 administrative fee for my continued non-compliance. There was also a notice that the HOA would be filing a lien against my property if payment was not received within 10 days. I forwarded the photos and documents to Janet, along with a text. "Merry Christmas" to me. She called me an hour later. I've filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order preventing them from placing the lien. The judge will hear it on December 27th. Can you be there? I'll be there. The hearing was in front of Judge Margaret Thompson, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had a reputation for not tolerating procedural games. Janet presented our argument, emphasizing that the underlying fines were based on an unenforceable covenant, and that allowing the HOA to place a lien before the case was decided would cause me irreparable harm. Linda Marshall, representing the HOA, argued that liens were a standard enforcement mechanism, and that I was trying to avoid the consequences of my voluntary agreement. Judge Thompson listened to both sides, asked a few pointed questions, and then issued her ruling. I'm granting the temporary restraining order. The HOA is prohibited from placing a lien on Mr. Xander's property until the underlying case is resolved. However, I'm expediting the main case. We'll have a full hearing on the enforceability of the covenant on February 10th. Both parties should be prepared to present their complete arguments at that time. Janet and I left the courthouse feeling cautiously optimistic. "February 10th is actually good for us," she said. "We won't have to wait months for a resolution." The next 6 weeks were tense but relatively quiet. I continued my normal farm operations, parking equipment at my house when needed. Carol continued to glare at me from across the street but did not approach me directly. I caught her on camera a few times taking photos of my property, but that was about it. Then in late January, something happened that changed everything. I was in my barn doing some welding work on a grain cart when my phone rang. It was Tom, my neighbor from down the street. "Henry, you need to get back to your house right now." "What's wrong?" "Carol is in your yard with bolt cutters. I think she's trying to cut your gate lock." I dropped everything and jumped in my truck. The drive from the barn to my house usually took about 10 minutes, but I made it in 6. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw Carol standing at my side gate, which led to my backyard. She was indeed holding bolt cutters, and the lock was lying on the ground, cut clean through. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, jumping out of the truck. Carol spun around, and for the first time since I had met her, she looked genuinely rattled. "I have every right to inspect properties for covenant violations. You have no right to trespass on my property or destroy my lock." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Get off my land right now. I'm an HOA officer conducting official business. You're a criminal committing property damage. Leave now or I'm calling the police." Carol's face hardened. She dropped the bolt cutters and walked toward the street, but not before getting right in my face. "You think you're so smart, but you're not going to win this. I will make your life hell." "That's a threat. I have it on video." She stormed off to her house, and I immediately called 911. Officer Rodriguez arrived about 15 minutes later, along with another officer I had not met before. "She cut your lock?" Rodriguez asked, examining the bolt cutters Carol had left behind. "Yeah. My neighbor Tom called to tip me off. I've got the whole thing on my security camera." "Can I see the footage?" I pulled it up on my phone. The video clearly showed Carol approaching the gate, examining the lock, and then cutting through it with the bolt cutters. The timestamp and my address were visible in the corner of the frame. Rodriguez watched it twice, then looked at his partner. "We need to talk to Mrs. Jennings." The three of us walked across the street. Rodriguez knocked on Carol's door, and after a long moment she answered. She had changed into a different tracksuit, this one teal, as if that would somehow make her seem more innocent. "Mrs. Jennings, we need to ask you some questions about an incident at Mr. Xander's property." "I was conducting HOA business," Carol said immediately. "I have the authority to inspect properties for violations." "You have the authority to cut locks and enter property without permission. The covenants give the board access to all properties for inspection purposes." "I'm going to need to see that in writing," Rodriguez said. "But even if it does, that typically requires notice and consent. Did you provide notice to Mr. Xander that you were going to inspect his property today?" Carol hesitated. "I shouldn't need to give notice for exterior inspections. His gate leads to his backyard." "That's not an exterior inspection." "Madam, Mr. Xander has video evidence of you cutting his lock. That's criminal mischief and possibly criminal trespass. I'm going to need you to come with us to the station." "This is absurd," Carol sputtered. "I'm the victim here." "He's the one violating our community standards. You can explain that at the station. Please turn around and put your hands behind your back." I watched in stunned silence as Officer Rodriguez placed handcuffs on Carol Jennings and read her rights. She protested the entire time, her voice getting higher and more shrill with each word. Neighbors started coming out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. Donald, the HOA vice president, emerged from his house 2 doors down, his face pale. "What's happening?" he called out. "Your president just got arrested for criminal mischief," I said. "She cut my gate lock." "Oh my God," Donald muttered. He looked like he might be sick. The officers put Carol in the back of the patrol car and drove away. I stood in my driveway, my heart still pounding with adrenaline. Tom came over and clapped me on the shoulder. "Well, that was dramatic." "I can't believe she actually did that," I said. "What was she thinking?" "She wasn't thinking. She's been on a power trip for years, and you're the first person who really stood up to her." Over the next few days, the story spread through Meadowbrook Estates like wildfire. Carol was charged with criminal mischief in the 4th degree and criminal trespass. She posted bail and was released, but she was noticeably absent from her usual neighborhood patrols. I heard through the grapevine that several board members were calling for her resignation. Janet called me on February 3rd. "I've got interesting news. Linda Marshall just contacted me. The HOA wants to settle. Seriously. Dead serious. They're offering to drop all fines, acknowledge your exemption for farm vehicle parking, and pay your legal fees." "What do they want in return?" "Nothing. It's an unconditional surrender. I think Carol's arrest spooked them. They're worried about liability if this goes to trial and you countersue for harassment." "I should countersue anyway." "You could," Janet said, "but it would drag things out and cost more money. My recommendation is take the settlement, get everything in writing, and move on with your life." I thought about it for a moment. Part of me wanted to make Carol and the board pay for all the stress and hassle they had caused, but the practical part of me knew that Janet was right. I had won. Taking the settlement was the smart move. Okay, let's do it. The settlement was finalized on February 8th, 2 days before the scheduled hearing. The HOA agreed to formally amend their covenants to include an exception for farm vehicles owned by residents engaged in active agricultural operations. They also paid Janet's legal fees, which totaled just over $8,000, and sent me a written apology signed by all board members except Carol. Carol herself resigned from the HOA board on February 15th. I heard that she was facing potential jail time for the criminal charges, though her attorney was negotiating for probation and community service. She stopped making eye contact with me entirely and seemed to spend most of her time indoors. The criminal case concluded in early March. Carol pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 1 year of probation, 50 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution for my lock and my time. The judge also included a strongly worded lecture about respecting property rights and the limits of HOA authority. By the time spring planting season rolled around, life in Meadowbrook Estates had settled into a new normal. Donald had taken over as interim HOA president and turned out to be much more reasonable than his predecessor. He even came over one evening to apologize personally for how I had been treated. "I should have stood up to Carol earlier," he said. "I knew she was going overboard, but I didn't want to cause conflict." "I appreciate that," I said, "but you stood up when it mattered. You voted against the fines." "For all the good it did, but at least it's over now." I continued to park my equipment at my house when necessary, and nobody bothered me about it. A few neighbors even came over to ask questions about farming, and I found myself giving informal tours of my operation to curious kids from the neighborhood. It was actually kind of nice to help people understand where their food came from. In late April, I was working in my front yard when a moving truck pulled up to Carol's house. I watched as movers loaded furniture and boxes for several hours. Carol herself emerged only once to supervise the loading of what looked like expensive artwork. She did not look my direction at all. By evening, the house was empty and the moving truck was gone. Tom came over with a beer in hand. "Guess she couldn't take living across from you anymore," he said with a grin. "I never wanted to drive anyone out of the neighborhood," I said. "I just wanted to be left alone to do my job." "I know, but I can't say I'm sad to see her go. Maybe we'll get some peace and quiet around here now." He was right. With Carol gone, Meadowbrook Estates became a genuinely pleasant place to live. The new HOA board, led by Donald and Susan, took a much lighter touch with enforcement and focused more on organizing community events and maintaining common areas. I even volunteered to host a farm safety seminar at the community center, which was surprisingly well attended. My harvester sat in my driveway several more times over the following months, whenever Marcus or another mechanic needed to service it. Nobody complained. Nobody called the cops. Nobody spray painted my garage. It was exactly how it should have been from the beginning. Looking back on the whole experience, I learned some important lessons about standing up for your rights, even when it's difficult and expensive. I also learned that most people are reasonable if you give them the chance, but there will always be a few who think rules are weapons to be used against people they don't like. The key is not letting those people intimidate you into giving up. I still live in that house, and I still farm those 200 acres. The combine harvester is getting older now, and I'm starting to think about upgrading to a newer model. When I do, you can bet that I'll park it right in my driveway for the delivery and setup, because I have every right to do so. As for Carol Jennings, I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that she moved to a condo in downtown Cedar Rapids, where she promptly got herself elected to the condo association board. I feel sorry for her neighbors, but at least they're not my problem anymore. The whole ordeal lasted about 4 months from start to finish, but it felt like years. The stress of being constantly harassed, the financial burden of legal fees, and the uncertainty of whether I would be able to continue operating my farm the way I needed to all took their toll. But in the end, justice prevailed. The law was on my side, and despite Carol's best efforts to twist rules and abuse her authority, the system worked. I learned that farm vehicle exemptions exist for good reasons. Farmers need to be able to move equipment efficiently and maintain it properly. Rural and semi-rural communities depend on agricultural operations, and the law recognizes that farming is not just a business but a way of life that deserves protection. HOAs serve an important function in maintaining community standards, but they don't have unlimited power. When HOA rules conflict with state law, especially laws protecting agriculture, the state law wins every time. The case became somewhat known in local farming circles. I got calls from other farmers who were dealing with similar HOA disputes, asking for advice. I always told them the same thing. Document everything, know your rights, get a good lawyer, and don't back down if you're in the right. Most HOAs will back off once they realize you're serious about fighting and that the law supports you. My relationship with my neighbors improved dramatically after Carol left. People who had been nervous about taking sides during the conflict became much friendlier. I found out that several of them had been rooting for me all along, but were afraid of becoming Carol's next target. That's the corrosive effect that bullies have on communities. They create an atmosphere of fear where people are afraid to speak up or support each other. The new HOA board even consulted me when they were revising the community covenants. They wanted to make sure the language about farm vehicles was clear and that there wouldn't be any future disputes. I appreciated being included in the process, and I helped them craft language that protected both agricultural operations and legitimate community interests. The final version allowed farm equipment parking for maintenance and repair purposes, with reasonable notice to neighbors if equipment would be present for more than 48 hours. It was a fair compromise that everyone could live with. My farm continued to thrive. Corn prices rebounded somewhat, and I had an excellent soybean yield that year. I was able to pay off one of my equipment loans early, and even hired a part-time helper for the busiest parts of harvest season. The stability of knowing I could operate without HOA interference made a real difference in my ability to run the business efficiently. I also started dating someone I met at a Farm Bureau meeting, a woman named Emma who worked as an agricultural extension agent for the county. She got a kick out of the whole HOA story when I told her about it over dinner. Only you could turn parking a combine into a federal case, she teased. It wasn't federal, I protested. Just district court. You know what I mean. Most people would have just moved the equipment and grumbled about it. I'm not most people, and my grandfather always taught me that you can't let bullies push you around. Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man. He was. I wish he could have seen how this turned out. He would have enjoyed watching Carol get arrested. Emma and I got serious pretty quickly, and by the following spring, she had moved into the house with me. She loved the combination of living in a community with neighbors and amenities while being right next to the farm. We talked about getting married and starting a family, continuing the tradition of farming that went back 3 generations in my family. The criminal charges against Carol also served as a cautionary tale for other HOA boards in the area. I heard from Janet that several HOAs had contacted her for advice on reviewing their covenants to make sure they weren't overreaching. Nobody wanted to be the next board that got sued and ended up with their president facing criminal charges. About a year after the settlement, I ran into Linda Marshall, the HOA attorney at a local coffee shop. I almost did not recognize her in casual clothes, but she spotted me and came over. "Mr. Xander, I owe you an apology," she said. I was genuinely surprised. "Oh, I should have advised the board differently from the beginning. You were right about the law and I let Carol's intensity cloud my professional judgment. I'm sorry for the role I played in that mess." "I appreciate you saying that. Water under the bridge now. Still, it was a learning experience for me. I'm much more careful now about making sure HOA rules are actually enforceable before I advise clients to pursue violations. That's probably good for everyone involved." We chatted for a few more minutes, and I left feeling like maybe some good had come out of the whole situation after all. If it made HOA attorneys more cautious about overreach, that would help other homeowners down the line. The incident also strengthened my connection to the broader farming community. Other farmers who had felt isolated or pressured by suburban encroachment saw my case as a victory for agricultural rights. I was invited to speak at a State Farm Bureau conference about dealing with HOA disputes, which was nerve-wracking but ultimately rewarding. I was not a public speaker by nature, but I felt like sharing my experience might help others avoid the same pitfalls. My message was simple: know your rights, document everything, and don't let fear of conflict prevent you from standing up for what's legally and morally correct. Farmers have been working their land for generations, long before most modern suburban developments existed. The law recognizes the importance of agriculture and provides protections for legitimate farming operations. But those protections only work if farmers are willing to assert them. As the years went by, the whole Carol situation became just a story we told at neighborhood barbecues. A remember when tale that got embellished slightly with each retelling. The Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, became a model of reasonable governance, and property values actually increased as word spread that it was a good place to live without draconian rule enforcement. I kept farming, kept parking my equipment when I needed to, and kept living my life the way I wanted to live it. That's all I ever wanted in the first place. The freedom to do honest work on my own property without harassment. It should not have been a fight, but since it was, I'm glad I won. The harvester that started the whole mess finally got retired after another 3 seasons. I sold it to a young farmer just starting out and bought a newer model with better technology and more efficient fuel consumption. When it was delivered, I parked it right in my driveway while I spent 2 days learning all the new systems and running diagnostics. A few neighbors came over to admire it and ask questions. Donald brought me a welcome basket with a bottle of whiskey and a note that said, "For the farmer who taught us all about property rights." That harvester, and every piece of farm equipment I've owned since, has spent time in my driveway when needed. It's a small thing, really, just parking a machine where it's convenient and practical. But it represents something bigger: the right to use your property lawfully, the importance of standing up to bullies, and the victory of common sense over petty tyranny. Carol Jennings probably never understood why I fought so hard over something she saw as a minor inconvenience or aesthetic issue. But for me, it was never about the parking space. It was about respect for the law, respect for agriculture, and respect for people's rights to live their lives without being harassed by small-minded bureaucrats who got a taste of power and let it go to their heads. In the end, the law worked the way it was supposed to work. The courts recognized that state agricultural exemptions superseded HOA covenants. The police took property crimes seriously, even when they were committed by an HOA president who thought she was above the rules. And the community ultimately rejected the kind of toxic leadership that Carol represented in favor of something more reasonable and neighborly. I still see Officer Rodriguez around town occasionally. He always gives me a nod and says something like, "Staying out of trouble with the HOA." And I always respond, "The HOA is staying out of trouble with me." It's become our little running joke, a reminder of those crazy few months when a simple parking dispute turned into a full-blown legal battle and criminal case. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had just backed down, moved my equipment, and paid the fines. Would it have been easier in the short term? Probably. But I would have spent the rest of my time in that house constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering what Carol would find to complain about next. And more importantly, I would have given up legal rights that farmers depend on to operate efficiently. By standing my ground, I not only protected my own rights but potentially helped other farmers and property owners in similar situations. The precedent was clear. HOAs cannot override state agricultural laws. That precedent matters, and I'm proud to have been part of establishing it in my community. The farm continues to do well. Emma and I got married in a ceremony held right there on the farmland, under a beautiful Iowa sky, surrounded by friends, family, and fields of growing corn. We're expecting our first child now, and I hope to pass down the same lessons my grandfather taught me about hard work, standing up for what's right, and never letting bullies win. That old harvester dispute seems like ancient history now, but it's shaped who I am and how I approach challenges. When something is worth fighting for, you fight. When the law is on your side, you stand firm. And when someone tries to abuse their authority to push you around, you push back, legally and appropriately, until justice prevails. I still live in Meadowbrook Estates, still farm my 200 acres, and still park my equipment in my driveway when I need to. And every time I do, I think about Carol Jennings and her bolt cutters and I smile. Because in the end, good people standing up for their rights will always defeat petty tyrants who think rules are weapons. That's the American way, and that's especially the Iowa way. We respect the law, we respect agriculture, and we respect each other's rights. Everything else is just noise, and I've learned to tune it out and focus on what matters: family, farm, and community. The rest will take care of itself.